Hi, what is the most absurd rule you have had to follow at work? At one of my first jobs, I was required to eat lunch when the bell rang, just like in school, but I worked in a lab, and sometimes, because of the experiments I was conducting, I had to skip the bell and eat lunch later. My coworkers reported me, so I started interrupting my experiments to have lunch on time. My productivity dropped dramatically, but at least I followed the lunch rules. We have a similar complainer at work. She constantly picks on a girl who was hired after her, even though she is clearly better at her job. She is probably jealous of this girl. She has complained about her to HR several times, and I am their manager. The other managers and I often joke that if the girl she complains about ever gets back at her, we will just stand by and watch. My friend worked for the city administration, mowing the grass. At noon, they would stop working and have lunch right in the park where they were mowing the grass. People complained to the administration that they were slacking off, so the rules were changed. Now, at noon, they would pack up their equipment, drive across town to the warehouse, have lunch there, and then return. Instead of a 30-minute break, they now spent 20 minutes packing up and traveling, 30 minutes eating lunch, and another 20 minutes traveling back and unloading. All so that passersby would think they were very busy workers. Once I was told at work that I couldn't drink water from a bottle at my workplace without a doctor's note stating that I needed it. I was a cashier at minimum wage in a grocery store. My visit to the doctor after that was quite amusing. The same thing happened to me, and I was one of the managers. I have been with the company for 10 years, and I always carry a bottle of water with me because staying hydrated helps me manage my migraines. I never leave home without water. Then we got a new store manager, and this woman jumped on me, saying that I was setting a bad example for other employees because can you imagine how much our productivity would drop if everyone had water bottles? It doesn't make any sense. I said that on the contrary, I would encourage everyone to bring water with them because it's good for health. Her face looked like a stunned fish. The doctor gave me a note that said, "My name and all other employees must always carry water with them. Employees who discover a spill on the floor are required to stand next to it until a cleaner arrives with a mop." Since I was the only cleaner, I was scolded in the following order. There's a spill, go get a mop. Why did you go get a mop? You should be standing next to the puddle. When I said, maybe you should hire a second cleaner, the manager's expression was priceless every time. I remember we had the same rule at the grocery store where I used to work. It was for safety reasons because if it was, for example, clear liquid soap, it was hard to see, but it was very slippery. The difference was that anyone could go get the mop, so you just had to call out to the first employee you saw. Or switch places, it didn't matter who was standing next to you, as long as someone was there. This rule took priority over any other tasks, even those of managers. I was reprimanded for my 16-year-old daughter walking behind me during an online meeting on Zoom. The manager who reprimanded me a little later interrupted the conversation to answer a question from her 7-year-old daughter who had entered the room. I even received an official warning for this. I quit immediately and have no regrets. I worked at an expensive flower shop while attending college, and we weren't allowed to sit down, even when there was no one in the store. And it was empty most of the day, as most people placed their orders by phone. So all the chairs in the shop were purely decorative, because apparently we had to look busy for customers who weren't there. I used to work in a furniture store in an empty shopping mall. On a good day, we would get 4 to 5 customers, and sometimes none at all. There were comfortable armchairs around, but if a mystery shopper caught me sitting down, I would be reprimanded. 3 such remarks, and I would be fired. I had a rule at work that no one could adjust their office chair. If you needed to raise or lower it or change the angle, you had to submit a maintenance request. It was very annoying. During busy periods, you had to wait several days for someone to come and adjust your chair. The funniest story I heard was from a friend who worked for a well-known telecommunications company. Her department was moving from one building to another. The move took place over the weekend to minimize disruption to work, but the movers had to carry things all night until Monday morning. At 8 a.m., when employees started coming to work, they noticed that their phones at their workstations were not connected. This was in the 90s, and most of the work was done over the phone. Everyone decided that it was just a misunderstanding, and one of the employees was about to plug in his phone, but his boss yelled at him to stop immediately because it was the union's job, and if anyone who was not a union member, and none of these employees were union members, touched the phone, they would be fined. After the workers had been moving all night to be ready for the start of the workday, The employees sat around doing nothing for 3 hours until a union worker came and plugged the phone wires into the wall sockets, which took maybe 5 minutes. I just can't comprehend this. If someone knocked on the door before opening time, we had to let them in. No way. I'll boot up my computer, tidy up the waiting room, make myself a coffee, and go to the bathroom to take a shit. The door won't open until working hours begin. My friend told me that at his workplace, everyone was treated to cake in the break room on employees' birthdays. But the time spent celebrating, i.e., awkwardly standing around with a piece of cake, had to be made up at the end of the day. I worked for a periodontist who made everyone clock out and log out of the system to sing happy birthday to the birthday boy. I worked at the skating rink from the age of 14 to 18. Day shifts usually lasted from 12 noon to 7 p.m., when the rink was open for birthday parties and other events. In the middle of the shift, if management decided that there weren't that many people at the rink and that they wouldn't need you for the rest of the day, they would ask you not to return to work after your lunch break. In that case, you sometimes had to wait up to an hour until they decided that they definitely didn't need you and you could go home. This waiting time was not paid. If you left without the manager's permission, you would receive a reprimand. It was 2003, and the only reason they could get away with it was because all the employees were teenagers. We were all friends with most of the regular customers, and we just liked skating. Most of us hung out at the rink until closing time anyway, even when we weren't on shift. We didn't even know that what management was doing was wildly illegal. I worked at a center where we cold called people. It was basically telemarketing. We sat in a room and made calls. I hated that job, but I really needed the money, and they paid $2 an hour more. They only hired women, and after I was hired, they told me we had a dress code and I had to wear a skirt. I soon quit because I began to suspect that there were cameras or mirrors installed just somewhere to film up skirts. The atmosphere was very creepy. There was a rule about how we had to answer calls. My last job was at a hotel. I won't go into the "Are you planning your wonderful vacation?" No, I didn't say that. Especially since more than half of the people had already made reservations and were most likely calling with follow-up questions. I categorically refused to say this nonsense. Women were required to wear makeup, foundation, lipstick, mascara, eyeliner, eyeshadow, blush, earrings, rings, bracelets, watches, hair accessories, necklaces, and have manicured nails. Men had to wear a tucked-in shirt, no beard on their neck, and not smell bad. I worked at a clown center where trips to the bathroom were deducted from your 15-minute breaks. If you got up and went to the bathroom while working remotely, after 30 seconds you would receive a message in TIMS. Are you okay? Why aren't you answering calls? We have calls waiting on the line. Get back to standby mode. When I worked at a supermarket in the crash prevention department, we were strictly forbidden to touch the carts, even though we stood next to the exit where many smart Alecs simply threw the carts after picking up their purchases, blocking the passage. If I had spent 5 seconds to move a cart, I would have been punished for leaving my post. Instead, I had to tell the senior cashier or someone else to move the carts themselves, even if the store was busy. Absurd. When you walk with a cup of coffee, it should be in your left hand, with your left arm bent at a 90-degree angle and your forearm parallel to the ground. Drinking coffee while walking was prohibited. I remember that we had a substitute teacher at our school who spent the first 15 minutes of the lesson lecturing us that all students must sit at a 90-degree angle to their desks. The lesson ended with one of the boys opening the emergency exit at the back of the classroom and half of the students running away so they wouldn't have to listen to this nonsense. So his method wasn't particularly effective. Listen, I'm a qualified teacher and mother of 2 schoolgirls. I know math. Do you men think you understand math better than women? Everyone. On Monday, when I called and reported the data, it did not match what the district manager had. As a result, this manager was demoted and transferred to work in a penalty store. When I told the district manager about rounding up to 3, he said that, technically, it was fraud. Later, she was fired from that penalty store after an audit. At one of my jobs, where I stood for 7 hours a day in a hot and stuffy factory room, we were not allowed to sit during our 10-minute unpaid break. We had to stand next to the seats, which were only for the unpaid 20-minute lunch break. Meanwhile, the managers who came up with this rule sat in air-conditioned offices all day, sipping coffee. This example of management logic and their way of motivating employees is clearly not the best way to get the most out of staff. Some customers were offended by how they were notified of the store's closure, and we were forbidden to say that the store was closing or had already closed. This meant that sometimes we had to wait a very long time before the manager finally approached customers and explained to them that the store was already closed. People were, of course, embarrassed when they found out that almost an hour had passed since closing time. And then we also had to wait for the cash register to be counted. It was awful. I didn't work at the stationery store for long, less than a week. One morning, there wasn't a single customer in the store. I asked the manager if I could tidy up the display window before the first customer came in. No, you have to stand behind the cash register so that it looks like we're ready if someone comes in. They made me just stand there like a robot. I leaned against the wall, the manager called from the surveillance room when he saw me on camera. Don't lean, you have to just stand there. There wasn't a single customer in the store, just standing motionless on the concrete floor behind the cash register for an indefinite amount of time. All for a measly $8. It was 2007. The next day, I quit. I worked at an expensive hotel. Here are some of the crazy rules I had to follow. First, always use a company pen for any notes. Second, if you need water, you should sit down at the bar so that guests don't see you drinking. You mustn't show that you're tired. Social media accounts should be closed so that guests cannot find you. It is unacceptable to have a life outside the hotel. It is unprofessional. Fourth, glasses cannot be taken out of the bar unless they are empty or dirty. Fifth, we couldn't say no to a guest. As a result, someone spent the whole day assembling a bed from IKEA because one guest's children wanted a bunk bed instead of separate beds. Sixth, if management heard a guest talking about you, an investigation would begin. And if they heard something negative, you would be fired immediately. Seventh, if you were fired, you were asked not to discuss it with anyone. I was asked not to talk about the rumors spread by management, about employees, about how I was treated, and so on. But I didn't sign anything, and it was a long time ago. Eighth, it was a multi-million-dollar chain with cruise ships, hotels, and so on. But they kept track of every penny. I was caught putting 10 pence in the tip jar and was reprimanded for it. In the end, I found out that I was fired on my way home from work because I gave a guest a free bottle of Coke in exchange. And that's not all I can remember. Women had to wear tights under their pants. When they said that tights were mandatory, I thought that this only applied to employees who wore skirts or dresses. So, on my first day, I came in wearing a pantsuit, but of course without tights. A colleague noticed this and, instead of telling me directly, reported me to management. The most ridiculous thing was that it was a job as a bank teller, where we sat behind a counter specially designed so that customers couldn't see our legs. There were panic buttons under the counter. I quit after a week. Thank you for watching this video to the end. What stupid rules have you encountered at work? Be sure to write about it in the comments. It will be interesting to read. Also, check out our previous video and good luck.